Ham radios KX4Z, somewhat of a loudmouth. I have a shares license, CS 521, a few others for data. I run 2 WinLink RMSs, one on ham radio, one on shares, and I manage quite a few VHF systems. I'm also a volunteer for Florida Baptist Disaster Relief. So I stay pretty busy. I want to emphasize that this HIPAA thing is a very rare issue. This doesn't happen that often. The need to transmit medical information is probably very rare in emergencies, unless you happen to be like a friend of mine stationed in a healthcare facility. If there were a need to transmit healthcare information, it might be diagnoses, allergies, medications, patient information, when there was a need to either find medicine for a specific patient, arrange care for a specific patient, or transfer potentially a large number of patients from a hospital that was failing or had been damaged significantly. And if that were to occur, it's probably because there's a very large disaster going on with huge impacts to the infrastructure of the area. These slides are based on the best that I could figure out. They come from a document that I wrote a couple of years ago. Also, I provided some of this information to some people today and got some very helpful comments from those people to improve this. So basically, I'm going to see if I can move this off my screen somehow. Basically, the Healthcare Insurance Portability Accountability Act, HIPAA, was enacted in 1996. Back then, I was doing a whole bunch of medical records electronics development. I had a bunch of engineers working for me, so I was intensely involved in this area. I had built anesthesia systems that handled immense amounts of patient information. There was a lot of legal uncertainty at that point, how to move information from one institution to another. And so HIPAA actually helped us out to some extent. It required the Secretary of Health and Human Services to issue regulations in key areas. Congress failed to act within 3 years. And of course, Congress failed to act. So the Department of Homeland Health and Human Services developed a proposed privacy rule, released that, got 52,000 comments, and published a final rule. I want to emphasize the privacy rule has to do with to whom you can give protected health information of a patient when you're trying to give it. That would be billing associates, other physicians, watchdog organizations, the State Department of Health, whatever. So privacy is basically saying you're not allowed to release information except to the right people. That rule has been modified, and I was reading tonight it's been modified even further. It's continuously being modified. There's a modification in process right now. Basically, as I talked about, it has to do with covered entities. And covered entities are basically healthcare groups, billing groups, associated groups that deal with patients and deal with their electronic information. The security rule was a big deal for all of us. It set standards for safeguarding the electronic information. So privacy said who you can give it to, security dealt with how you have to keep it secure before, during, and after you give it or whatever. Security rule was promulgated in 2003. These rules are very scary to healthcare professionals because they had big dollar tag fines associated with them, and hospitals were at great risk when things like laptops were stolen, that sort of a thing. But they basically provided a framework for systems designers that really helped out healthcare in a lot of ways. So first, I'm going to talk about the privacy rule. It came first. And as you'll see, this has very little practical impact on emergency volunteers, such as amateur radio operators. There have been people who have argued that this does not apply to amateur radio operators, arguing that you are not a covered entity. That's not guaranteed because the HIPAA privacy rule applies to disclosures that are made by employees, volunteers, other members of a covered entities or business associates workforce. And it's not, in my opinion, guaranteed that you are not possibly a volunteer. For example, I know the group south of me in Ocala, they're all trained by their hospital, and badged and credentialed by their hospital. So they look exactly like the typical candy striker in a hospital. They would certainly be considered a volunteer for the hospital. Whereas if I'm just an ordinary Aries or other volunteer and I get shipped over to a hospital, that might be different. I would not count on the fact that you're exempt from this rule simply because you're not a covered entity. You might very well be considered that. You're basically, however, for most of us, we're a technician and we're involved in intentional and permitted disclosures of protected health information. So I want to point out that the privacy rule recognized that for the safety of patients, we often move information back and forth between different professionals and different institutions, which is important. I mean, that's what I did a lot in my career, with dig up information on patients who came to me from far-flung institutions and needed surgery at my institution. I had to know their medical conditions. That was part of my job. Yes.
I need to interrupt for.
Fixed, unmute the phone.
Oh, I think I did it right that time.
Here we go.
Okay, there you go.
Much clearer.
All right, can folks hear me now?
Yes, we can't see you, but we can hear you. Go ahead.
All right, sorry. Okay, so now the security rule, in my opinion, is fairly important to us as amateur radio operators. It defines the protections that are required when storing or transmitting protected health information. So obviously that's down our bailiwick. This was broken up into different categories. Administrative safeguards, that's things like passwords and lists of who's allowed to do things. Physical safeguards, locked rooms, computers that don't stay logged in forever. And technical safeguards, which is right down our bailiwick, what you're allowed to send and how it has to be sent for us. Now, the authors of the security rule wisely recognize that we don't have utopia. So they didn't write that you had to do perfection. They made basic requirements very important. Think laptops with passwords. If you lose a laptop today that has protected health information on it and it wasn't encrypted, your hospital's in big trouble. That's going to be a problem. So everybody who deals with protected healthcare information on a computer has it completely encrypted. And most of us refuse to have any protected information on our computer. We try very hard to make sure that it does not stay on our computer, that the programs don't store anything on our computer. Anything beyond that, exotic technical security was made addressable, and that's a key word. That means that you have to explain what your decision was, and particularly security and transmitting information outside of one institution to another, which is where we would come into the picture when a large patient transfer needs to be made or when equipment needs, medical stuff needs to be ordered. That was made addressable. So a lot of flexibility. People were directed to protect the integrity of the information, protect the security of the information, but they were told to use security measures that were appropriate and were within their grasp in their location. And that meant that they were allowed to consider the size, complexity, and capabilities of the covered entity. So little bitty hospital, less requirements, great big huge hospital, more requirements. The technical infrastructure, hardware, software security capabilities of the hospital or of its business associates. Because remember, people who handle billing get a lot of information about you. You have to consider their abilities, the cost of the security measures, and critically in all this, the probability and the criticality of potential risks. So you're not going to spend $1 billion on something that'll almost never happen. So here's where I think it applies directly to the frontline hand. And this is 45 CFR 164.312, subsection E, technical safeguards. First off, transmission security You have to implement technical security measures to guard against unauthorized access to electronic protected health information that's being transmitted. There are two subsections to that. Integrity controls implement security measures to ensure that the protected information is not improperly modified. So you can't have transmission that is faulty or flaky. You need to have transmission methods that are actually good. But this is addressable, so you can explain your choice afterwards if someone asks a question. The healthcare institution, when they're in the normal everyday business of this, has already made those decisions, and they're going to have it written down what they're going to do. In an emergency, you guys might want to jot a note about what you chose. Encryption was specifically for the purpose of transfer between institutions made addressable. So you have to, you encrypt when it's deemed appropriate, and it's not a requirement. And that's been made clear in multiple arguments back and forth, not only in the ordinary literature, but particularly in the ham radio literature, in the FCC literature. So I'm going to try to present some suggestions here, and these probably are not unique or original with me. I've gotten some of them from some other people. These are my suggestions for how you might want to transfer protected health information in a disaster. And remember, the real goal here is to keep protected information secure so that people can't delve into other people's personal data. But remember, even if you have just joint information that looks like it doesn't give away who the patient is, there have been studies done to show that we can put together who that patient was with relatively obscure pieces of information. So in my business, I try hard to protect patients. I don't try to leave tracks of things that other people don't have a right to know about that patient. And we consider that important for the care of patients. I'm not a lawyer, so this is not legal advice. Any of you guys make a mountain out of a molehill. I'm just trying to give you practical stuff. So the thing is, choose the best radio. Most of us the amateur radio service, but many of us wear other hats. So for instance, you may have shares authorization where encryption could be used and where there are lesser requirements for openness. You may have RACES authorization available to you, which will allow you to potentially contact other portions of the federal government or state government on different frequencies and different techniques. So if you have any of those that you actually know how to do, then you might want to advise an entity asking for your assistance that you have these other alternatives. If you know that normal communication systems work, then certainly you want to use those. If you did just that is really all that's left, okay, that's a different story. You want to explain the best you can what the pros and cons are so that people who are making the decision what to do are well advised. Use the least common technique that you can. I heard stories of people who lost their jobs because reporters listened to repeaters and picked up juicy tidbits of information. You don't want that happening to a patient. So you might want to avoid recognized voice nets, published frequencies of emergency nets. If you have to move this stuff, you might ask, can we go to a different frequency? Can we move off? Voice transmissions, of course, are easy for people to listen to with a lot of different simple techniques. So you might want to choose something that the news reporter is a little less likely to have access to. Use unusual frequencies, certainly legal frequencies. Short range VHF, UHF, if you have to move a lot of data, would be a lot better way to go. Using lower power potentially and more secure than using long range. HF. I'm a fan of digital transmissions, and the reason is, remember, we're trying not to kill the patient. So if you transmit information that becomes garbled, with voice transmissions or repeated relays, this is a problem. You're responsible for providing integrity of that transmission. So I recommend using some sort of an ARQ, acknowledge request system that would have less problems with integrity and possibly less eavesdropping, although I happen to be the person who proved that you could eavesdrop on a pector communication without much difficulty at all. There have been unwarranted attacks on ARQ technologies that, in my opinion, miss the fact that these are excellent technologies for these kinds of purposes that fit right in with Part 97.1. I want to point out that technical information in any field, not just medicine, could be very easily garbled by people who are unfamiliar with it. So I give you a few examples. Levothyroxine, 50 micrograms every day. If a person doesn't know what MCG is or can't spell levothyroxine, that's an issue. Levofed, 0.02 micrograms per kilogram per minute. That is a fatal drug if you get that decimal point in the wrong place. L-Dopa, 84 milligrams oral inhalation. That's not a drug that most people would know much about. Try doing this kind of stuff when you're transferring 300 patients from one institution emergently to another by voice. That's not going to be a good day for anybody. Antennas, obviously, if you have the chance to use a directional antenna, that reduces the chance. You don't need to use any more power than necessary to get the information across to the other guy. And if you're using ARQ technologies, that's going to be taken care of if you just turn the power down a bit. Software, here's where we run into some problems. Be aware that the WinLink people have been somewhat coerced into publishing material moved on their system on a web portal, and apparently that happens even if you move the information by peer-to-peer the next time there is a connection to the internet. I'm not totally an expert on that. That's my understanding. My suggestion would be that if you're down to using ham radio and you want to use WinLink, because it's an excellent way to do this, you might want to send a quick email to the administrators of that system and say, see here, I'm moving traffic in support of such and such, and it's going to be protected health information, and I'd urge you to delay and restrict publication of that information. You know, that's just being nice to your neighbor, doing the right thing for your patient. You could consider using peer-to-peer systems that don't have any way of publishing. I think I hit a button. The FLDG system has ARQ techniques built into it. EasyTerm, free from UZ7HO, can send YAP files, which is a packet technique for moving files, and it's error checked. So there are other ways to move traffic that fewer people know about, but they do exist. This part is my opinion. Recognize that the WinLink group is certainly not a covered entity in medical care. Thus, they would be unaffected by the HIPAA privacy rule or security rule. However, anybody can be sued. And if you disclose information, sensitive protected health information of victims of the disaster, that would not be wise in my estimation. And that might offer an opening for a tort claim. And I think it would be a very hard-hearted WinLink critic who would criticize the WinLink folks for saying, man, we can't put this on the website. If you can show us that you have permission from the patient to view this protected information, we'll make that available to you. I think this would be extremely rare that this will ever happen. And I would presume that if it ever does, the WinLink folks will respond quickly and take care of this problem for you. If you've never used EasyTerm from UZ7HO and never used YAP, this is a technique worth learning how to do. It actually can do an auto receive, and you just click send on your end, and it proceeds pretty much by itself, sort of the way that WinLink works. It can be used over VHF, UHF at 1200 baud. Can also be used over HF at 300 baud. It works. We've done it here in Gainesville. FLDG, the NBMS system, this also works. There are some compression modes within these systems that I've actually tested, and people have improperly criticized these kinds of techniques as being impossible to reconstruct. That's not true. I know how to do it. I've shown people how to do it. However, not a lot of people are willing to go to the work to do that, and a challenge that I published in the FCC literature has never been taken up. No one's ever read transmission that I moved across FLDG with their built-in compression, even though it could be done. So those are alternatives for you. Computers. Anytime you've got protected health information on a computer, that's an issue. So after the incident is over, consider removing any possible files that are left on the computer. If you're already based, I know some groups are, at a healthcare facility, then it's likely that the security team at that institution has already provided you with whole computer encryption. And if not, you probably want to ask for that and get limited physical access to those computers with protected passwords on those computers. If you're doing medical records information by way of voice relay, an NTSNet, an RINet, or an ARIESnet, you probably want to ask intermediate operators to destroy physical copies of the message as soon as they're done with it. That's not something you want them to have because that's a risk. That could be done with an op note in the radiogram where you could just say, protected health information, please destroy after use, that sort of thing. If you're doing peer-to-peer WinLink connections, which I know a lot of, well, at least the group south of me, prefers to use for protection of protected health information, before you reconnect to the internet, you might want to discuss with WinLink administrators, hey, how do we prevent this from going onto your system or becoming presented there? You might not want to do that. And at that point, I think they would be able to help you out. It's not so easy on your own computer because this information is now stored in databases rather than in files, and it's beyond my ability to know exactly what to do with it. You would want to take any other steps that you could to protect the confidentiality of protected health information. And you probably would be wise to document, just jot down a little note, what you were asked to do, the options you presented, the decisions that were made on an ICS 214 as part of your record keeping. And then to keep a copy of that if you're ever asked, well, gee, why did you move this traffic? It showed up on such and such a site. And then you'd have some explanation. In all cases, I really encourage people to just do what's right for the patient. When we're talking life or limb, this is not a time to argue the fine points. You try to move the information that the physician or the hospital administrator is asking you to move for the benefit of the patients. Don't just give them a knee-jerk response. Lives may literally be at stake for what goes on. Again, this is likely going to be a very rare situation, but if it happens, then you don't want to hold up progress here. That's what I've got. That probably opens the floor for a good bit of questions. I'm not sure how I am going to hear them, so somebody probably wants to help me with that. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Gordon. Appreciate that. I'm going to lower your screen, I think.
Okay, I can hit stop share.
Okay, that works too. All right, you're on the phone, and so I don't see any hands up here yet. Barry, do you see?
One hand, and I have a couple of, well, at least one chat question.
Okay, go ahead, Barry. Takes a few out of the text there.
Okay, so David wants to know, is it correct that requests for blood for specific patients require transmittal of specific personal information? Did you hear me, Dr.
Well,
Gibby? Okay.
Okay, so normally a blood bank in a hospital acquires blood from the regional blood center, and I don't believe they transfer any protected health information. They just say we need 10 units of O negative, we need 30 units of platelets and whatnot, and they typically keep a good store of blood in the hospital. So that information would be unlikely to be needed to be moved. Now, if you got into a really bad situation, it's potentially possible that someone needs to move blood for a specific patient. I once used 500 units of blood for a particular patient, and that probably was notable. But in general, I don't think that's something that's going to happen very often.
Okay. Okay. Then this one, this is more of a comment, I think. Many in-hospital requests require 2 patient identifiers, first name, last name, and date of birth. For blood, there is also a medical record number. In everyday use, blood transfusions, specifically use type and cross lab tests. Patients and blood are to be transfused and are on the same site. Okay, that's that comment. Let's see. Someone books non-emergency transportation and they require 3 identification points. Okay. And also for blood, there's a blood bank number. Let's see. I can find it. Outside our scope tonight, but could the WinLink Express message feed to the internet 21 days be turned off? Does the WinLink administrators have that power?
I assume they do.
What was that
I
again?
don't think that's happened to them yet.
Could you repeat
Okay.
that, Barry?
Okay. Could the WinLink Express message feed to the internet, which is 21 days, be turned off? And I believe the WinLink administrators can do that.
Anything
But you
can,
have-
first of all, pending messages stay on the system for 21 days and then they disappear.
Okay.
Red messages don't stay there that long. I don't remember. I think we keep changing it. I think it's 2 weeks. But all messages from the United States amateur community may be viewed by the radio message server system operator that sent it, because that's the FCC requirement. It's also available to users who have an account with WinLink and use the system, US users. It's also available to them. We're doing that in order to comply with what the FCC requested that we do, and that Riley Hollingsworth asked us to do, and that is provide his, I forgot what you call them, official observers or whatever they are, the people that are doing the self-regulation for the ARL, to provide them with information so that they can monitor what's going on. So we provide that information. However, anybody that has, I have talked to the FCC, and the FCC related that packet radio or any digital radio service, really they don't mind in a situation like that, that an emergency situation, or in a situation where you're in an incident command, a formal incident command under an authority having jurisdiction, they don't mind if you send such information that's protected, as long as you don't encrypt it. But they think that the average Joe is not going to be able to copy that information or see that information, and I agree. The other thing is that if you have the time, you could call the FCC watch and get a verbal STA from probably a critical infrastructure partner or an authority having, or a civil agency, in other words, and get within minutes. And that stay would be applicable for 24 hours. You fill out a form if you need an additional amount of time for the STA, and you can move forward with that. There's a public notice that the FCC just put out recently that states all that in much better language than I can. So hopefully this is helpful.
Okay. Yes, very helpful. Jim Piper, who was a retired nurse, wanted to be sure that it's brought up that an important aspect of HIPAA, during a federally declared emergency, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security can waive it, can waive the HIPAA regulations. So if we ever come up with a really bad situation.
It's not not Homeland Security, it's Department of Health and Human Services.
Health and Human Services, I'm sorry. My acronyms get screwed up sometimes. So
But again, I want to,
they can waive HIPAA, which might help.
I want to point out that HIPAA is not our biggest issue, because in general, the things that we hams do, as long as we're exercising any reasonable thought at all, are very unlikely to come to attention of other people, because not very many people can read the digital transmissions that we frequently use. So as long as you're taking some reasonable care, it's unlikely there. The concerns I have are more with stuff that shows up on computers later on. You want to try to avoid creating civil liability for yourself or others in those processes. So you just do the right thing and don't publish information about patients.
Mm-hmm. Yep, just to be very, very careful. Here's a question. Maybe we could address this some other time, Dan. Someone wants to know a real quick explanation of what shares is. Maybe Steve can do that.
Shares is not ham radio. Shares is a service that is provided by the cybersecurity end of the called CISA end of the Department of Homeland Security. It is a contingency emergency communication system by member agencies, and shares and all of its employees do recommend the use of amateur radio for the installation, implementation, and operation of HF radio. Shares has a huge WinLink system run by the Department of Homeland Security. It's got a big ALE voice system, and it has regular nets like Mars or you know, your state nets and what have you that take place weekly. There's a Central United Earthquake Consortium network of the 8 states involved in the New Madrid fault. It is an option provided by the government that excludes the FCC Part 90 type exceptions for equipment, which means you can use opened up ham radio equipment. You can use amateur radio operators to implement the service, alleviating that time that an employee would need to operate, and lets the employee do what he does that volunteers can't do. It's growing like a weed, and I highly recommend, if you're interested in emergency communication as a volunteer resource, that you look into it further.
Okay, great.
And I want to echo that.
Okay. Is an Arden Mesh connected file server that requires users to have passwords adequate for HIPAA during emergencies?
Well, you know, Arden Mesh is not encrypted. And the way that I set mine up, it doesn't allow encrypted files to move across it normally. There you have the advantage that you're on a microwave frequency. You can move those to a frequency that's not within Part 15. You can move them outside of the public bands. And you have directionality to the antennas, so you're making very wise choices. But you'd want to still be just careful about what you do so you don't put stuff out there and make it easy for people to eavesdrop on your system. Presuming you know your line of sight, then it's going to be relatively difficult for anyone to eavesdrop on that system. So it would look real good as your system for moving data.
Okay. Another interesting question: was there a single event that started all of this HIPAA stuff?
Not that I'm aware of. It's just that I constantly see people being concerned, in my opinion, overly concerned about this, and scared to move data and scared to take care of patients and things like that. So 2 years ago, I wrote that document and just kind of sat around, and then all of a sudden I got a phone call saying, hey, can you talk about this?
Okay. Another interesting question: when a medical provider exchanges HIPAA protected data with another provider, does the telco need to concern itself with HIPAA, or is it in the two ends of the circuit which are responsible for HIPAA compliance?
This is such a great question because it just points out that the vast majority of communications by healthcare professionals are not encrypted. They're over ordinary telephone communications. They're over ordinary fax machines by the thousands every day. And of course, it does require some physical effort to tap into a telephone. And most people no longer use wireless phones that are easy to eavesdrop on. And there are laws preventing people from eavesdropping on cell phone communications. But that's an acceptable risk that people just take day in and day out. So if you exercise any reasonable care in your amateur radio, I think you'll be viewed very positively.
Okay.
We need to let Dr. Bob comment if he's thinking about these same issues.
Okay. He can speak up anytime he wants to. This is
Well,
another good. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I've got some few issues that I thought would bring up maybe from a slightly different perspective to help people answer the question, okay, as an amateur radio operator, what does HIPAA mean to me and how am I likely to ever run afoul of that? And I think there's some issues that maybe if we understand HIPAA, why it came about, that it would help all of us as ham radio operators to understand what our role and potential risk is, which I see as minimal. So let's go back 40 years, if we will, to when I was practicing medicine early on in my career. There was no electronic medical record. It was all paper charts. When a patient came into the hospital, I called down to medical records. I said, I need the charts on Joe Simpson, birthday February 4th, 1947. In a few hours, those charts would show up to the nurse's station. I would look through the chart to get the pertinent information that I needed, and that would take some time. The people at the nurse's station would see me. They knew the chart was there. They knew I was reading it. I got the information. I did what was needed to do. Move forward to the 1990s when electronic medical records started coming about. With my computer right now that I'm on, I can dial in, that's an old term from a modem. I can log into my hospital system and I can access the medical records of every patient in the hospital. Now, there are ways that you can get in serious trouble for doing that, but with that technology, suddenly we have a whole different problem here. This isn't picking up a paper chart that we're bringing from medical records downstairs. Suddenly, every chart is available to me via the electronic medical record. And you have to have some way to protect those records, and that's why HIPAA came along. And you say, well, so what? When I first went into practice in Florida, Evel Knievel was in the intensive care unit of the hospital I was in. I was seeing a patient in the bed right beside him. Recently, been a few years ago now, my wife, who's also a physician, came in to say that she, who was a radiologist, had read a mammogram of a well-known celebrity's wife who had very advanced cancer. She did not tell me who it was, and I never knew who it was until it became public. It was Kelly Preston, who was John Travolta's wife. Now imagine if I had logged on, gotten that information, sent it out to some of the tabloids, the issues that could have caused. Now, let's take one extreme example. Let's say that I have the neighbor from hell, so to speak, living beside me. He doesn't like my ham radio. He doesn't like my antenna. I've got a big tower. He's causing all sorts of problems, and it's just been this way. It's just been awful. Turns out he's also a very public figure. He's running for city council. He's always in the public eye, but suddenly he went out of the public view, and it turns out he was in the hospital for a couple of weeks. When asked about it, it's personal. I don't want to say anything. Well, you know, I don't like this guy. I log onto the computer. I found out why he was in the hospital. Turns out he was recently diagnosed. Now, this is all made up, but this is the type of thing that can happen and does. Turns out he is diagnosed with HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, the cause of AIDS. Turns out that he got this by a single encounter with a young boy. He's a married man who has 3 children. Can you imagine what would happen if I decided to throw that information out in the public? So we have to have some way of protecting that sort of information, and that is the purpose of HIPAA. And I can tell you that every time I log on to the computer to access those medical records, the hospital knows I've logged on. They know whose records I'm looking at. I will occasionally get requests from friends. Bob, my mother's in the hospital. This is a common one. Could you just check on her and look up and make sure they're doing everything right? That requires me to access a medical record that I do not have the authority to access, that I can get into real trouble. And I have to tell them I can't do that. You know, legally, I can't do that. If I'm consulting on the case, then that's something that I can do. But so, given those examples, And the real reason that we have HIPAA, imagine now you're an ham radio operator who's volunteering in an emergency situation. There's been a hurricane, the cell phone towers are down, we don't have telephone access. You're transmitting emergency information back and forth between a hospital and, say, emergency technicians out in the field. What type of information are you going to be transmitting that's going to rise to the level of me exposing a neighbor with HIV or exposing a celebrity? Those are entirely different worlds that we're in. And I think that for most ham radio operators, the real risk of HIPAA is that it's not a risk. We still want to take what Gordon said and make common sense approaches to make sure that we do protect that information. But HIPAA really was designed to protect that celebrity with breast cancer and a mammogram that we don't want sent out to the public domain, and not really worry about the amateur radio operator who was helping coordinating emergency medical technicians with a hospital because cell phone service is down. We've had a hurricane and we have no way of communicating that information. The chances of a ham radio operator giving information such as all of the drugs that a patient is taking, et cetera, that's real, but that's not that big an issue. It's more of the communications of data back and forth between a hospital and maybe emergency technicians and whatnot. And what I meant to do actually before I got into that is that some people I'm sure don't know me. I've been a ham for 50 years. I also was a practicing attorney for a while, but I don't claim to be an expert on HIPAA. I did medical malpractice law, defense work, and I'm back practicing medicine full time. So I do have a little bit of knowledge of the legal aspects of what becomes an issue and what doesn't become an issue. And I think for the most part, we as ham radio operators have very little to be worried about as far as violating HIPAA. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do the things that Gordon mentioned as we should. We should protect the laptops, et cetera, et cetera. But fearing that the big government and Uncle Sam's gonna come down on somebody for talking to a hospital about EMT services and that sort of thing during an emergency, I think the issue of that is really, it's a non-issue. I really wouldn't be that concerned about it. And I think that if we all understand why HIPAA came around, getting back to those examples, and compare that to what would come up in ham radio and disaster situations, it's not a stretch to say, you know, that's really two totally different worlds. We still need to be common sense. We still need to be careful with our laptops, et cetera, as Gordon said. But the reality is, I think from a legal perspective, the chances of anybody, unless you just do something grossly negligent, the chances of a ham radio operator being liable for some HIPAA violation is really remote, I think, in most circumstances. In an emergency situation where there is no communication, how is somebody really going to say you were negligent when you're doing the best job you can, unless you just did something truly grossly negligent? So I just wanted to kind of put it in the perspective of a practical issue, why we have HIPAA, what it's meant to do, and how that really does an impact of what we would be doing as ham radio operators, and we can feel fairly safe that we can do our job, provide the emergency communications, and not have to worry about somebody suing us after we did that. And that's really sort of the main comments that I wanted to make.
Okay. Well, speaking of that, another question. The country is about to vaccinate lots and lots and lots of people. Hams will probably be involved in vaccination clinics. What issues should the hams be aware of? Because obviously there's other communications that's available. You know, if they're going to be using the hams, you know, what should they be aware of?
Well, I'm not sure I understand how hams are going to be involved in vaccinations unless we're talking about some sort of situation where, say, as a marathon, we have hams who are at various stations of providing communications. The typical vaccination clinics, if you will, that I have been reading and hearing about are going to be at various healthcare facilities, such as your local drugstore, your hospital, Costco, some of these other types of places. And I'm not sure what role we as ham radio operators will be playing in that, but I'm willing to be educated on that. Again, the type of information that is needed for vaccination is not going to be the high level medical record protected information that we're talking about in these other situations.
Okay.
I might be able to offer some insight on vaccination clinics, as I have been directly involved in them for several years with flu clinics, and these are mass vaccination versus an isolated thing like at CVS or something like that. And I'm not sure either what amateur radio operators will be doing, because the way a typical mass vaccination clinic is managed is that clients or patients, wherever you want to call them, they have a check-in table. There's an ID check and whatever else is going to go on. A little bit of paperwork. They're given some information about what the vaccination is. They're aimed toward a nursing table where we poke a sharp pointed object in their arm, not even asking who they are, but we inject them and send them on their way. And so there's, I'm not sure what amateur radio operators, unless there was a shortage of needles or they needed more vaccine or something, and there was a major telecommunications impact, and they had to call back somewhere and say, hey, we need another 1,000 doses. But beyond that, you know,
Right.
I don't think there's anything more than that for vaccination clinics.
Right. Okay.
I'll jump in here for just a second and say that I was involved with the polio vaccine thing as a teenager when that went on. And we used amateur radio to make sure supplies were running smoothly and all this. I can see with the upcoming injections for our COVID thing, where the temperature is a problem. When you start getting into rural areas of the United States, the small communities, small towns where they may not have those facilities, and they have limited communications, that's where amateur radio may become became a value. That's the only way I can see it, but I just want to throw that in.
Okay. When someone points out that patients who have signed a consent to be treated in a hospital have signed a document that says in case of an emergency, personal health information may be shared without their permission if the care provider deems it necessary for the health and safety of the patient. So that's something we also need to consider. And someone is making a question about the recent 2016 didactic coursework to prepare for the National Registry of Emergency Medical Technicians test. They were informed to never use a patient's name, without which it is unlikely any of the data communicated to the receiving emergency department would be sufficient to determine who the 70-year-old female or 6-year-old male patient is, who would 99% of the emergency communications amateurs provide for hospitals or the Red Cross needs the patient's name. Probably don't. Okay, let's see.
Let's take a break and pick up a couple of these raised hands.
Okay.
Joe, WA2, JOE, do you want to come in here and give us your question?
Hi, thank you. So I'm the guy who threw gasoline on this fire 6 or 8 weeks ago on the IO forum. But I will say that I learned a lot, and that there are some incredibly informed and knowledgeable people out there, and passionate as well, for those of you who are involved in that. One thing that struck me was that, yes, absolutely, these are emergency situations. We do not want to put a patient at risk by over-exercising authority that we think we have and might not. So I am in total agreement with that sentiment. One thing that came up was it seemed that it might be prudent to at least advise the medical people who are asking you to pass potentially HIPAA-covered information, just a friendly reminder that this is not secure, just as an FYI. Someone even suggested maybe a little sign on your table. That seemed reasonable to me. And if one of the doctors or others wants to comment on that, I'd appreciate it. But never ever to not transmit information that's life-saving. And finally, when using WinLink, which is whether or not WinLink is encrypted. So for instance, in many jurisdictions, the airwaves are open to the people, but in some jurisdictions, if police first responder traffic is encrypted, the Motorola trunking and so forth and so on, it is then considered private, and it is illegal to eavesdrop on that under the law in that jurisdiction. Whether or not that would apply to WinLink, which technically is a digital mode or not, I'm not sure, but that would be something to consider. So if any of the experts would like to comment on the concept of, at the very least, issuing a friendly, gentle advisory that this is not that this is not secure, not a secure transmission mode, and then of course passing the traffic. Thanks.
Okay. Why don't you pick that up? Gordon, you want to pick it up?
Well, it's certainly not a secure method, and you probably, you've been put there. You're working with these people. You want to explain what you can do and what you can't do, and you want to tell them there's no expectation of privacy in amateur radio. We're going to do reasonable items to try to make sure this doesn't end up on the front page news, but we cannot guarantee any security to it. If you move to a different service, if you have access to shares or something else, you could improve on that. But there's nothing that's 100%. And I agree completely that the most important thing is to take care of the patient. If they're down to sending stuff over ham radio, you're in a hell of a mess. So try to be helpful to them. If you have access to encrypted systems, that's great. Take advantage of it. Most of the things that we can do in digital techniques, we have to spend weeks teaching someone how to even receive them. So something that it takes weeks to teach one of our new hams how to do, that's reasonably helpful.
I got a comment.
Okay, Steve.
Okay. Regardless of whether you're using encrypted or unencrypted, whether you're using shares or amateur radio spectrum, regardless of the data you're carrying, remember that we are in usually formal incidents, and that as such, we are a transport layer, or we are carrying traffic from agency to agency or intra-agency traffic. Those people that give us that traffic usually know what they're doing and who they're dealing with. And as Gordon just said, if you're down to the point where your total communication infrastructure is out and you have no internet, and you're using WinLink to bridge the internet, or you're using voice in the place of land mobile radio public safety, things are not very good. And I doubt very seriously at the time of the transmission that any conflict will occur. That is, I think it's Bob, Dr. Bob has pointed out, take that off of your computer and delete it when you're through. After you do your 309 and you know what your traffic is and the numbers of messages you've sent, and you report that back to the incident, that's when you take that off your computer. There's no point in having personal information of patients on your computer when you don't even know who they are. The message has been sent, it's been received. There's no point in you having it in your sent folder. Just delete it.
Good point.
Very good. Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate the counsel.
Okay, let's pick up Bill here real quick over in Tennessee.
Hi, thank you, Dan, and thanks to our physician friends. I just recently retired from about 35 odd years in critical care, and the last several of those years were spent in IT dealing with the exact electronic medical records that that we've been talking about. And you know, we had endless classes on both HIPAA security and HIPAA privacy. And I think that I really appreciate Dr. Bob for helping to put the ham radio community more at ease. And I think that word needs to get out, because some people are just completely scared spitless about doing that, and forget, you know, every time they go to a doctor's office and become a patient in a doctor's office, every time they go to a hospital and they sign a consent to treat, any of those things, part of the document that they're signing says, if stuff gets bad and you need to share a PHI about me, then you can do that without my express permission. And I think those kinds of pieces of information need to be really shared with the ham community to avoid the paranoia, because the main deal is to treat the patient, not the cotton picking rules, as somebody that doesn't understand them may have misinterpreted them. And again, thanks to our two physicians for coming and making that clear. And I really appreciate particularly Dr. Bob for helping to try to alleviate the fear that some ham radio operators may feel. And I'm done. I appreciate it. Thank you, Dan, for the time.
Okay, Bob, you might want to comment to that.
Sorry, I just couldn't get the mute off. Well, I think that's very important. And I think the problem is that one of the issues with HIPAA is that I, as a physician, obviously have to pay attention to it. But the interesting thing is that the federal government doesn't really tell me exactly what I'm doing is right or wrong. I can call or inquire as to whether or not this is HIPAA compliant, and rarely will they tell you yes or no. They'll refer you back, well, you need to do these general things, you need to make sure, well, but is this HIPAA compliant? Oh, you know, and it's really very vague, but they've done a very good job of scaring us, because I get propaganda all the time. If I run afoul of HIPAA, I'm going to have a $50,000 fine per incident of this, that, or the other. And it's unfortunate, because I think too many in the ham radio world are seeing that. And we really need to understand, it's, for my purposes in ham radio, it's not going to be that much of an issue.
Okay.
Okay, let's get.
And I've been trying to raise my hand. I haven't been able to get in.
Okay, go ahead, Martin.
I've been involved with EMS for like 42 years as a paramedic and instructor, and a couple interesting things. One of the issues with HIPAA that came from one of the hospitals I worked at. And there was a couple of physicians discussing a case in an elevator. And it turned out the family member of the patient was in the elevator, and that was a multi-million-dollar suit against the hospital. And at the JCO, which is the Joint Accreditation of Hospital, things we have to go to every year, it became a big, big thing. And on the transmission of stuff, especially, or again, when I teach it also, you never give out any identifiable patient information, even if it is a trunking system, and most small organizations or EMS organizations, even New York City, does not have it encrypted for patient information. So just the age, sex, and race of the patient, and then the issue with what the patient's problem is. So those are two little tidbits I could throw in.
Okay, Gordon, you want to comment to that?
Yeah, those are wise things. You just use common sense. There are going to be studies that show that if the patient is unique enough, you can still identify them. But remember, we're only in this picture when things are bad. And so we're not going to be held to the same standards. And as Steve has pointed out, we're the peons in this. We're the technicians. We're the transport layer. Exercise reasonable caution. You know, when you see that the cell phones are all working, the internet's all working, hey guys, could you send this, you know, with your normal systems? And other than that, just don't get that bent out of shape about it.
Dan, do you want to get Tom? His hand is up. Dan?
Sorry, I was on mute and didn't realize it. Tom, W3TDH, you want to take it away?
Thank you, sir. I'm retired out of 45 years of service in fire and EMS as a volunteer. And the problems we had nothing to do with transmitting to the hospital or like that. The problem we had were firefighter EMTs who like to talk about things. And even in the station, we had to beat it into their heads that you can't talk about these anymore. You know, I was around when HIPAA came in, and we said you can't discuss patients anymore. You can't discuss a patient that you were not on the call of, and you can't discuss the patient you were on the call of with anybody but the people providing care to the patient. So if two hams after the incident start chatting like the elevator example about something they handled, that's more of a problem than doing your job and getting the information through. If you're polite and discreet, you don't talk about people. And as long as you do that sort of thing, I don't think anybody's going to climb down your throat with combat boots on. And the other thing, I may have misunderstood our presenter's statement, but one of the things we're doing here in the Mid-Atlantic, because I've worked on several of the stations, is we're putting in a thing called the Mid-Atlantic IP network. And the board made the deliberate choice to use Part 15 frequencies for it because we're trying to serve hospitals and operations centers and health offices and so forth. And as long as it's Part 15, they can encrypt it to the nth degree, anything they're capable of doing. And nobody can complain about that because it's no longer ham radio. And if you don't think that generated an argument among hams, well, then you haven't been with many hams lately, because there was. But you don't need to be subjected to that. The end effect was, if we just remind each other not to be stupid about what we say outside of the work environment, we're probably going to be all right. You know, you can recognize people and just go humph and make that the only comment that ever escapes your lips about the fact that you recognize somebody, and you're fine. But if you say, did you see what that council member had in their house? You just, no, you know, people let you in when they're at their worst, and you've got to be at your best. So as long as you maintain a high standard of conduct for yourself and a modicum of discretion, I think we're fine. I can't see. Besides, the other thing that makes me bomb-proof is I'm not worth suing. The vast majority of hams are not worth suing. We don't have a deep enough pocket to make the lawyer want to come after us because they spend more money than they make. Back to Nip.
All right. Okay, let's just take one more hand, then we got to get back to these written comments. Paul, KD7ISA, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Paul, KD7ISA. I think if we do any teaching of people, what Tom just said needs to be given a lot of attention to, because he's lived through that era where the incidental talk could really get people in trouble. The other thing I found out in different places, including work, is when you get into new territory, such as a disaster or an incident, everybody freaks out, you know, $25,000 fine. And so I think there may be hams or hospital people that might be overcautious. So if we know as much about this as possible, we can help them to make reasonable decisions that won't be stifling the information. And I don't know if that question on the blood got answered, but for the most part, like Dr. Gordon said, you know, the medical director or somebody's going to order so many units of B positive blood, but there's no identifying information in that. The blood will get to the hospital or the location, and the only time the information is shared is going to be between medical professionals. I'm going to go downstairs with a piece of paper that has information on it. The lab is going to do the testing right there on site. I get the right bag of blood. I take it upstairs. The nurses have it. So the hams are not involved at all, other than to say, we need 10 units of B positive blood. That's it. The last thing I was going to ask, where someone said protected, not encrypted, and they said FCA form or something asking permission. That was one of the shares guys, I think, that answered that question. I'm done.
Okay. Gordon or Rob, you got anything to comment at this point?
The use of Part 15 devices for microwaves that can be encrypted, that's a great idea. Ham radio stuff can't generally be encrypted, and so you're going to want to move off of Part 15 frequencies because you're in the clear. So you want to create other ways to stop people from eavesdropping on you. Loose lips sink ships. Keep your mouth shut about what you read and what you do in volunteering. Just good common sense. And again, you know, we're at the transport layer here. We're not making a whole lot of decisions. Our job is just to advise and consent and get the job done.
Okay. Bob, you have anything you want to add to that?
I think the only thing I would add would be about the elevator incident, and the situation in the hospital when we're caring for patients who have various diseases is a different situation than what we as ham radio operators are going to be doing. And I think it's really more of a common sense, as everybody has said. Just be careful what you're saying. But then again, what would come up in a ham radio setting in a disaster is not going to be a patient who's suffering from breast cancer or a patient who's suffering from acute medical illnesses that we might see in a hospital. So I still think the level of paranoia needs to be greatly reduced in the ham radio setting of a disaster. But nevertheless, common sense is always advised.
Okay, Barry, go ahead and let's take some more of those questions.
Okay. In a mass emergency, or I'm assuming it's a mass casualty emergency, would it be sufficient to not use names, but to utilize a triage tag number, which is probably a good idea, as a means to transmit patient info, especially pre-hospital admission, and an ID number assigned to the patient post-admission?
That would be up to the incident commander of the event.
Right. But it's a good other way of avoiding using names. If they're using triage tags, it's going to be a pretty serious situation.
Usually, even at a scene of a real incident where there's a lot of problems, the triage tags sometimes get misplaced. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't use that as a way to identify patients. It's usually at the end of the incident where all the tags are collected. And this way they can follow from the incident to the triage to the transport sector to the hospital. I don't think we would be involved in that as ham radio operators.
Right. I mean, Paul from Oregon says HIPAA has about 12 different exceptions to the rule. Okay. Let's see. He says, hey, it's the government. Okay, true. And someone else also concerned about civil liability as opposed to other kinds of liability. And that's basically Part 15. There is no pecuniary interest rule. Hospital employees being paid who are hams can continue to operate, but the FCC has issued a waiver for hospital employees to use their ham radios in an emergency and when they're drilling as part of their regular job. And that's basically all of the questions from the chat.
Okay. Is there anything to add? Bob, you want to add anything?
No, I think we've covered a lot of good ground here and raised a lot of interesting issues and comments. So I don't have anything else, Dan.
Okay, thank you. Gordon, I'll ask for you to speak in a second, but when we get done here, would you send me your presentation so I can make it available to the people here after the meeting? Go ahead, Gordon.
Sure. Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of stuff. I think a lot of people have expressed a lot of good common sense comments.
Okay, unless we got some more questions, I don't see hands up. It's been a good presentation. I thank both of you, really do. Appreciate it very, very much. Lots of good stuff got shared here. I will, I think I'll pull the plug on this and call it a good meeting and get the stuff set up so everybody, what happens here, for those that don't know, is I send this out to a couple thousand hams and they forward it off. And so there's a lot of people who see this presentation. So thank you for your participations and what you've done here tonight. Okay, with that in mind, I'm going to
Thank you
close
all
this
for
out.
coming.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you all
you.
for coming.
Thank you very much. 73s.
Have a good evening.